So chapter 7, fluid and electrolyte imbalance. This chapter is somewhat complicated. I believe the most important chapter in this section is the next chapter, actually, chapter 22, which is the kidney stuff. But do spend a little bit of time in chapter 7. There's some terms in here that we'll talk about. But the basic concepts of fluid and electrolyte balance, there's this idea that you have intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid, and your entire human body is about 60% water. The intracellular fluid is about 40% of our body weight. So if you stepped on a scale this morning, 40% of your body weight is inside of a cell, inside of your muscle cells and every cell in your body, your brain cells. And then about 20% of your body weight is outside of your cells, extracellular fluid. And I don't like that term, extracellular. It's very confusing because most of this is just in your blood vessels. Extracellular fluid is your blood flow, your blood flowing throughout every blood vessel in your body. That's what extracellular is talking about. Your plasma, the portion of your blood that carries the red blood cells, extracellular. So you can play with these ratios if you're interested. If you've ever lost more than 2 pounds of weight in a week, you have lost water weight. The human body, if you're trying to do a crash diet and get rid of some excess fat, if you're losing more than about 2 pounds over a week's time, you're actually just dehydrating your cells. You're losing water weight. And so fluid shifting in and out of your cells is a feature of your diet and nutrition. One thing that I've experimented with a lot over the last 5 years or so is a ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet is basically a high-fat diet where you completely eliminate any sugar. And so if you eliminate carbohydrates or sugar from your life, you're teaching your cells to power themselves with fatty acids instead. One of the things about a ketogenic diet is, if you've never tried it, most people who are dependent on sugar, which is most people in the world, if you're dependent on sugar and then you go keto, there's a syndrome that we call the ketogenic flu or the keto flu, where after the first week or so of no carbs, you just feel terrible, feel horrible. You have a headache and weakness and fatigue and just feel like you have influenza or something, muscle aches. What's happening with the keto flu is you are diuresing. You're peeing out a lot of water. And along with that water, you're losing a lot of salt. And so the first week of going keto, people can lose 10 pounds in a week pretty easily. But what you're actually doing is dehydrating, which is not necessarily healthy. And so to prevent a keto flu, the recommendation is to make sure you're drinking plenty of fluids and also eating plenty of salt. And so you're not losing all those salt in the water and getting dehydrated. And then the opposite of that, what I've found with myself is if I'm keto for a week or so, no sugar, no carbs, and then I splurge on cookies or something, I can gain a massive amount of weight overnight. And what that weight actually is water, because water tends to follow sugar into your cells. And so it's not uncommon for me to gain 5 pounds of water if I go off my keto diet, which I do try to do at least once a week or so. It doesn't seem to be super healthy to stay hardcore keto year round. People can shut their thyroids down, actually. It's one of the weird random problems of sticking to a keto diet. I believe that moderation is key with anything when you're changing your eating and things like that. Then the third type of fluid is what we call interstitial fluid. And this is just the fluid that's between the cells. It's not in the blood vessels, and it's not inside the cells. It's floating around between the cells. Interstitial fluid. So you got 3 different fluid compartments. Your extracellular is just actually your blood flow in that capillary there in this picture on the slide. The extracellular fluid is inside your blood vessels. The intracellular fluid is inside your cells. The key terms for this chapter, really there's only two ideas here, even though this slide has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 terms. There's actually only 2 concepts that we need to understand. The first is hydrostatic pressure, the force of the fluid pressure in the blood vessel. So if we go back to that slide, in the blood vessel, your blood pressure is generating a force that tends to want to move fluid out of the blood vessel. Hydrostatic pressure. It's trying to move fluid out of that blood vessel. And then the opposing force, which is trying to keep fluid in the blood vessel, is osmotic or oncotic pressure. And most people, most doctors and nurses, use those 2 terms interchangeably. In fact, they'll use all 4 of these terms interchangeably. Osmotic, oncotic, osmolality, osmolarity. All of those 4 words are just talking about the pressure that is keeping the fluid in the blood vessel. The oncotic pressure is specifically talking about albumin. The osmotic pressure is actually mostly talking about salt. But whatever the case, you've got salt and albumin in your blood vessel, and that attracts water. It's trying to keep the water in your blood vessel. The hydrostatic pressure is trying to push the water out. The oncotic and osmotic pressure is trying to keep the water in your blood vessels. Here's a picture that demonstrates that. You've got fluid in your blood vessels. the hydrostatic pressure, which is really your blood pressure. It's trying to push the fluid out, but your albumin and your salt trying to keep the fluid in. The oncotic pressure is primarily driven by albumin. So what is albumin? It's just a protein. It's a protein, and it's the number one protein floating in your blood vessels. We've got lots of other proteins, but albumin is really the only one that we care about because it's the biggest. So how do you get albumin in your blood vessels? You eat protein. You eat stuff like a steak. Yogurt is high in protein. Anything that has protein in it that we eat is broken down into amino acids by your gut, and eventually it winds up in your blood vessels as albumin. So the number one protein in your blood vessels, albumin. And that's also the number one thing that keeps the fluid in your blood vessels. It keeps the fluid in your blood vessels. The word tonicity is, if you've taken a chemistry class, they talk about this in chemistry a lot. In nursing, really the only way that we use this term, this idea, is when we're hanging IV fluids. When we're hanging a bag of IV fluids, we like to know, is this fluid isotonic? And what that means is it has the same tonicity as the blood. And the most common, I would say 95% of the time, when we are hanging an IV fluid at the hospital, it is 0.9% NaCl. The other name for 0.9% NaCl, normal saline. Normal saline. What is NaCl? Well, that's the chemical abbreviation for sodium. Na is sodium, and Cl, chloride. Sodium chloride. 0.9% sodium chloride matches the blood perfectly. And so what this means is if we're running an IV with normal saline, fluid won't shift in or out of the blood vessels. It will just stay in the blood vessels. Normal saline is just, we use it constantly, all the time, for everything imaginable. And I hadn't realized how much we use normal saline until a few years back. It might be 4 years ago now, I can't remember. But a hurricane hit Puerto Rico. A hurricane hit Puerto Rico, and the entire world suddenly realized that every single IV bag of normal saline was made in one of 2 factories that were destroyed by the hurricane. And so suddenly we had this crazy supply chain catastrophe, and no hospital could even get a bag of normal saline. And so that's called the supply chain, which is in business for a hospital, where do we get our supplies from? And now that we are in the middle of a pandemic, we've definitely noticed supply chain issues. And that first became clear when we ran out of masks early in the pandemic, March, about a year ago now, March of last year. Suddenly there was a worldwide shortage of N95s, and they were selling on eBay for like $1,000 just to get a mask. That's the supply chain. And we had it was about 4 years ago, normal saline. We just couldn't get it. And all the hospitals in town, we had to rewrite our policies as far as hanging blood, for example. When we give someone a blood transfusion, we always use normal saline with that blood, and suddenly we were out of normal saline. Another isotonic IV solution that we hang a lot of is lactated ringers. It calls it Ringer's lactate here on the slide, but in Nebraska, it's referred to as LR. LR. The doctor will write an order, hang LR at 150 cc's per hour or milliliters per hour. That's how he'll write the order. So LR, lactated ringers, also isotonic. We sometimes hang an IV bag of half normal saline, 0.45 NaCl is also called half normal saline. And if you look at normal saline on the previous slide, 0.9%. And half normal, 0.45%. NaCl. But what is NaCl? Table salt. Table salt. So if you're eating supper tonight and you say to someone, please pass the salt, that's what NaCl is. And we add table salt to water to make it isotonic. Half normal saline has half as much salt in the IV bag, and it's called hypotonic. What that means, a hypotonic IV solution, I'm going to go backwards to this slide with the blood vessel and the cells. If we infuse hypotonic, half normal saline, all of that water is going to actually move out of the blood vessel and into the cell. Hypotonic solutions move out of the blood vessel and rehydrate the cell, which is perfect if your cells are all dehydrated. So we use half normal saline for dehydration. Dehydration. The opposite is a solution that's hypertonic. Hypertonic. And we use a hypertonic solution like 3% normal saline if we want to suck water out of the cell and back into the blood vessel. So a hypertonic solution is going to draw water out of the cell. Why would we want to use that? The most common case is cerebral edema. Cerebral edema. When somebody's brain cells are swelling for whatever reason, your brain cells are swelling, and if they keep swelling and filling with water, like a water balloon, they will eventually pop. We don't want that to happen, so we start an IV with a hypertonic solution like 3% normal saline. Another common solution is mannitol. Mannitol is a drug that we use to treat cerebral edema. And the way it works is it's hypertonic. So it pulls water out of the cell and into the blood vessel. From there, where the water goes is down to your kidneys and you pee it out. Another IV solution that we hang all the time, and we did this twice in clinicals on Monday and Tuesday of this week. We hung an IV, in this case it was actually a bottle, a glass bottle. We spiked the glass bottle with our IV tubing and hung it up and infused it. And the medication was called albumin. We actually give albumin as an IV solution specifically to pull water out of the cells. And both of those patients had liver failure. Now that I think about it, they both had liver failure. And a common problem with liver failure is you swell up. You swell up all over. You retain water, and a lot of times you retain it in your belly, and that's called ascites. And our patient on Tuesday, he had so much ascites in his belly, just water that had leaked out of the blood vessels and had actually leaked out of the cells as well. And it was all in the ISF, the interstitial fluid between the cells and the blood vessels. And the doctor ordered a paracentesis. And what that is the doctor and two nurses wheeled a machine into the room. The machine was a Doppler so that they could see where the doctor was stabbing a needle. He took a giant needle, huge needle, stabbed it right in the guy's belly. And then they hooked the needle up to tubing. And on the cart, one of the nurses was pushing, was about 15 huge glass bottles. The glass bottles have a vacuum inside of them. And so the doctor stabbed the needle in the belly, and the tube was inserted into the glass bottle, and the bottle filled up with ISF fluid, interstitial fluid, that we call ascites. When it's in your belly, we call it ascites. And they filled up 10 of those bottles, which means that this poor man had 10 liters of fluid in his belly. You get that much fluid in your belly, and the big problem that he was complaining of was all that fluid started pressing on his lungs. He couldn't breathe. He felt short of breath because his belly looked like he was 9 months pregnant. He just drained it off. So the doctor did drain it off with the needle, but he also ordered albumin. Albumin helps draw that fluid back into the blood vessels, and then you pee it out. The second drug the doctor ordered to help him pee it out was actually Lasix. And so that's a very common order the doctor will write. Give albumin, and then this doctor wanted us to wait an hour. We waited an hour for all that fluid to move into the blood vessels. And then he said, give 40 milligrams of IV Lasix. And then the man just peed it all out. So that's albumin is a hypertonic solution, and so is 3% normal saline, so is mannitol, and it's to move water out of the cell into the blood vessel. The other major thing to know in this chapter, which is kind of what I've just been talking about, but they specifically have a name for that, and the name is Starling Law of Capillaries. The Starling Law of Capillaries just means that you've got two major forces regarding movement of fluid out of the capillary beds. The capillary beds are just the little tiny blood vessels. The two opposing forces, hydrostatic pressure, trying to push the fluid out, osmotic pressure, trying to pull the fluid in. If you have some kind of a problem with either of those forces, you can have edema. And the most common place that we see edema is in your feet and ankles. That's usually the first place we see it, feet and ankles. If you have an increased hydrostatic pressure, that could be caused by multiple things, but basically your blood pressure tends to be high and it's trying to push fluid out. And that can cause edema. And then the other problem is if you have a low albumin, then you have reduced osmotic pressure and you can't keep the fluid in your blood vessels. The reason the liver guys have a low albumin is because your liver makes albumin. When your liver shuts down, you can't turn that cheeseburger into albumin because your liver's not working. The other person who has low albumin is the malnourished person, somebody who's not getting enough to eat. In the United States, most commonly we see this in the nursing homes. The nursing home patients who just lose their appetite for various reasons. And so actually the state law requires the nursing homes have to track how well their patients are eating. But if you have a little old lady in a nursing home with swollen ankles, she might have congestive heart failure or super low albumin because she hasn't been eating. The normal plasma osmolality is 290. I really can't think of any time you would ever need to know that in real life. I memorized this number when I was in nursing school, and then I never used it one single time. But if you're interested, try to memorize this number, 290. That's your blood vessel plasma osmolality. And then if you're ever hanging an IV bag of fluid, every single IV bag has printed right on the bag, and nobody has ever read this. I have because I'm a nerd. It's kind of cool. I would recommend reading the IV bag because it will tell you right on there what the osmolality of that bag is. And so a bag of normal saline will say right on there, 290 milliosmoles. Other than that, I'm going to just keep trucking because I can't imagine that you'll ever use that at the bedside. The osmolality, it's kind of interesting. No. Something that you will use, though, at the bedside, and I would encourage you to dig in deep to this one thing. I think we've talked about it before. Can't remember. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The reason I encourage you to dig into this one thing is because we give tons of meds that affect this system. And so if you're doing nursing school clinicals and you go into the patient's room with some lisinopril, that's a common med that we give. It's an ACE inhibitor. your nursing instructor might ask you in front of the patient, how does this med work? Patient might ask you that. In fact, patient might say, how does that med work? Well, the way the med works is it works right in this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, the RAAS. The RAAS is a way for your body to bring your blood pressure back up. For whatever reason, you've got a low blood pressure. This could be because you got dehydrated, maybe. Maybe you were working outside in the heat of the summer, 102 degrees, and you forgot to drink some water. You got a little bit of heat exhaustion, and you got dehydrated. When you get dehydrated, your blood pressure goes down, and then your kidneys figure that out. Your kidneys immediately figure out my blood pressure is low. And then your kidneys release renin. They release renin. Renin in a roundabout way ends up as angiotensin number 2. So all these little steps along the way, the only one we care about, angiotensin number 2. Because angiotensin number 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor. Potent vasoconstrictor. The second thing that happens, which is actually totally unrelated, and it's confusing on this slide because it makes it look like number 4, aldosterone. It makes it kind of look like it's all the same thing. Totally different. Renin is converted into angiotensin 1, which is converted into angiotensin 2, and it clamps down your blood vessels. A totally different thing that's happening, aldosterone is working in your kidneys to hold on to salt. Aldoso. I don't know how, that's how I always remembered it in school. Aldoso. Sodium. Aldosterone causes your kidneys to hold on to sodium. And sodium is salt, and water follows salt. Water follows salt, and what that does, your kidneys stop peeing as much, and your blood vessels get more fluid in them, and your blood pressure goes up. So steps 1, 2, and 3 causes your blood vessels to clamp down. Step number 4 causes more blood in your blood vessels. Both of these things are working to raise your blood pressure. Your book has a real nice picture in the PowerPoint slide here also. You have low blood pressure sensed by your kidneys. Your kidneys secrete renin, which causes your liver to kick out this substance called angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen then is converted to angiotensin number 1. We still don't care about any of these things. Angiotensinogen, angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted by angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE, in your lungs. Still don't really care. What we care about is angiotensin number 2. Angiotensin number 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor. It clamps down your blood vessels. Your blood vessels are clamped down. Your blood pressure goes up. The ACE inhibitors, that class of medication, lisinopril, most common one, lisinopril works in the lungs. It works in the lungs to prevent angiotensin 1 from being converted into angiotensin 2. So people take lisinopril if they have high blood pressure. You got high blood pressure, we got to bring it down. The fascinating thing about angiotensin 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor. Another step in this pathway, which is not on your slide and it's not in your book, is after angiotensin 2 does its job, the angiotensin 2 converting enzyme, ACE2, breaks it down. It's the reason it's not in your book is we didn't know about it and we didn't care until the COVID showed up. Coronavirus showed up, and suddenly that's all anybody would talk about. The step that's missing from this slide, ACE2, angiotensin number 2, converting enzyme. The reason we care about that is because if you have long-standing high blood pressure, you've been living with high blood pressure for 20 years, and you keep forgetting to take your blood pressure medicine. The longer you live with high blood pressure, the more your body tries to bring it down. Your body tries to bring your blood pressure down, and the way it does that is it creates more and more and more ACE2 receptors. The ACE2 receptors are trying to break down the angiotensin number 2, which is causing your high blood pressure. The angiotensin 2 is causing your high blood pressure by clamping down your arteries. And almost everybody in the world has high blood pressure by the time they're 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old. And the ACE2 receptors break down the angiotensin 2. Your body's trying to fix itself. It's not working real well. But now you have tons of angiotensin 2 receptors. And guess what? That receptor is how the coronavirus infects your cells. So this whole RAAS system is definitely relevant today, because the people who are dying from the coronavirus are the people who have high blood pressure and have more ACE2 receptors. And your book doesn't even talk about that, which I think is amazing. I'll talk about this one slide and then we'll take a break. This slide introduces the word natriuresis. And that word, I prefer the word diuresis. Diuresis. If we give Lasix, we are diuresing our patient. We're helping them pee off excess fluid. Natriuresis just means the Na stands for sodium. That's the chemical symbol of sodium. So this just means you're peeing off both salt and water. Water follows salt. These are exciting chemicals because we've just discovered them in the last 10 years or so, and we are using them all the time at the bedside now. Specifically BNP, brain natriuretic peptide. The brain natriuretic peptide was first discovered in the brain. That's why it has that name. But actually, it's your heart that is secreting it, and we order it as a lab test all the time. If we are worried that a patient is fluid overloaded, if you are fluid overloaded, your ventricles stretch. When your ventricles stretch, your body tries to fix itself. And the way your body tries to fix itself is by dumping out BNP. At the hospital, they call it pro-BNP on the lab tests, because then we draw your blood, we measure your BNP to figure out how fluid overloaded that left ventricle is. If that number is sky high, we know your body is trying to diurese itself. The medication that we give to diurese you, the number one diuretic that we give is Lasix. Essentially, BNP is just naturally occurring Lasix. Your heart muscle makes its own Lasix, which is super exciting and super cool. And we just discovered it about 10 years ago and started using it all the time. So you'll see that on your patient's lab work. I'm waiting today for a BNP to come back on my doggie. My little doggie, Penny, she's about 12 years old, which means in human years, she's like 1,000 years old. I don't know, she's really old, 90 years old or something. She has bad tooth, but the doctor won't put her under for surgery to take her tooth out until her BNP lab test comes back, because the doctor thinks she probably has some heart failure. She probably has some heart failure. That left ventricle, her little doggy ventricle, is distended because it's fluid overloaded. And so we're waiting for that lab test to come back. And as soon as it comes back, then they'll take her into surgery if it's okay. If it's sky high, then they're probably going to give her little doggy Lasix. That's what they do. We give dogs Lasix for heart failure, just like we do humans. So I skipped a few slides in the PowerPoint because there's a lot of mumbo jumbo in there. That's super boring. And I kind of already talked about it. There's several different electrolytes in this chapter that the chapter has a pretty good little summary of electrolytes. The one, I'm really only going to talk about two electrolytes. The one that nurses spend all of their time fiddling with is potassium. So doctors and nurses care a lot about high or low potassium. The other one that we do care about, but this would probably be something you would fiddle with at home more likely, is high or low sodium, hypo or hypernatremia. We do see patients in the hospital with really low sodium, but this will apply to your own personal life, probably a little bit more. So I want to talk about low sodium. High sodium, not so much. We don't see that as much because your body can compensate fairly quickly for that. But a super low sodium is any serum sodium less than 135. That's the magic number of a normal sodium. If it gets less than that, you have hyponatremia. Hyponatremia just means low sodium, low salt. And there's really two types of hyponatremia. There's the hyponatremia where you get a loss of salt and water, That's called hypovolemic hyponatremia. Excessive sweating, vomiting, and things like that. What we tend to see much more often, way more common, hypervolemic hyponatremia. And what this really is talking about, it's not so much a problem with sodium. It's a problem with too much water. Too much water. And so excess water dilutes your salt. And so when we draw your labs, when we check your lab work, it looks like your sodium is super low. But in reality, you just have way too much water. There's a real fancy word for one of the common syndromes. It's SIADH, syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone. That's a very confusing syndrome. A more likely cause of diluted salt, and something we see quite a bit actually, is somebody who is drinking too much free water. And free water is water that does not have salt added to it. If you're thinking to yourself, isn't all water free water? The answer is yes, you are correct. Normal saline, which is the IV fluid that we hang, is not free water. It has salt added to it. So drinking too much free water, meaning it's free of salt, it might cost you money. If you have a water bottle, water bottles are expensive, but technically that is free water. It's free water because it has no salt added. If you drink way too much free water, you will drop your sodium. Your sodium level will get very, very low, potentially. When your sodium level gets low, what's actually happening is you're diluted, your salt is diluted, but that means your serum osmolality is also low. What this causes is water to move from your blood vessels. It moves out of your blood vessels into the cells. Your salt gets really low in your blood vessels. The water moves out of your blood vessels into the cells. Those cells take in way too much water and they start swelling. They start swelling and swelling and swelling. Pretty soon, like a water balloon, they can burst. And a tragic consequence of this is cerebral edema. It tends to affect the brain cells more. The reason for that is because of the blood-brain barrier. Water and salt doesn't equalize as well in the brain. So there's all kinds of stories in the newspaper, on TV or online, where a patient dropped their sodium too low too quickly by drinking too much free water. There was a radio DJ here a few years back that got charged with manslaughter. And the reason is the radio DJ was running a competition, and I can't remember I think it was called No Pee for a Wii. And he was giving away is that a Nintendo Wii, a video game console?
Yes.
You guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And then the competition was you had to drink as many gallons of water as you could without peeing, and whoever went the longest without peeing would win the prize. Well, people started dying. The reason people died, they were drinking free water, which means they dropped their sodium level, which means their brain cells swelled up, cerebral edema. They fall into a coma, have full-blown tonic-clonic seizures, and then they die. So that's called hypervolemic hyponatremia. Big fancy word, just means you dropped your salt levels too low. There was a high school football coach in California some years back who also got charged with manslaughter after some crazy number, like 6, I think, of his high school football kids died. And the reason they died, they were doing 2-a-day workouts in the heat of summer, and the coach didn't want them to get dehydrated and was making them drink tons of water so they wouldn't get dehydrated. So, he's on the right track. He meant well, but it was free water, meaning no salt added. And they all got cerebral edema and died. So that's why we use things like Gatorade. Gatorade has electrolytes added to it. Gatorade, in my opinion, is not a great replacement solution, though. If you are running an ultra marathon through Death Valley, you will still get a low sodium if all you're drinking is Gatorade. And the reason is you can tell that Gatorade is not good because it tastes good. A truly isotonic solution tastes salty. And that's important for nurses and healthcare providers to know, because this is a problem with kids. Kids can get severely dehydrated very quickly from diarrhea, the leading cause of death. It's like number 2 cause of death worldwide for kids. They get really bad diarrhea, get super dehydrated. So we want to rehydrate those kids, but we have to be very careful to encourage fluids that have enough salt in the fluids. And Pedialyte is an example. Pedialyte is a fluid that we give kids to rehydrate them, and it has saved probably millions of lives, but it tastes terrible because it tastes salty. But ultramarathon runners, guys that are out there running 100 miles through Death Valley, guess what they're drinking? Pedialyte, because Pedialyte is isotonic. It has the correct amount of salt. It doesn't taste good, it tastes salty, and it's kind of hard to get kids to drink it. I'm not a big fan of Gatorade because Gatorade is actually just high in sugar and doesn't quite have enough salt to be considered isotonic. Any questions about that? Low sodium. The lowest sodium I've ever seen has been in 2 different little old ladies who were watching Dr. Oz. And Dr. Oz says, if you want to live forever, make sure you're drinking enough water. And if you're a little old person, you're not drinking enough. So you got to drink more water. Drink more water. So these 2 different patients of mine took that to heart. And they were convinced they weren't drinking enough water, and they started ruminating about it. And it kind of turned into an obsessive compulsive disorder, and they were filling gallons and gallons of water. jugs and just kept it right next to their chair. It didn't take very long before their sodium dropped catastrophically low. And they both came in seizing. The magic number is about 118. So back on that previous slide, the normal sodium level is 135. If you get lower than that, you have hyponatremia. If you get down to about 118, that's the textbook level, to where you will have full-blown seizures. You start seizing at 118. Hyponatremia. Hypernatremia, we do worry about. This is more likely to happen when somebody is dehydrated. It's not so much that there's, well, essentially it's the opposite of the dilutional hyponatremia. In this case, their blood is concentrated, usually because of dehydration. So that's why we see hypernatremia. Notice the sodium level greater than 145. So normal sodium, I went back 2 slides, 135 to 145. Memorize those numbers if you can. 135 to 145 normal sodium. The simple antidote for high sodium is to rehydrate people. The next electrolyte I want to talk about, potassium. Potassium is by far the one we spend the most time messing around with. We mess around with potassium in the hospital all the time, constantly hanging bags of potassium, reinfusing potassium. If you've ever passed pills, if you're a med aid or pill passer, you have given potassium, I'm sure. They come in, potassium pills come up as giant horse pills, and your patient will always ask you to break it in half because they can't swallow it. Could you break that potassium? So potassium, definitely the electrolyte to know everything about if you can from this chapter. This would be the one to study. It is a major intracellular ion. Sodium is the major extracellular. So the potassium is found inside the cell. Serum levels, meaning your blood levels of potassium, are affected by all kinds of things. Your pH, fluid shifts. Potassium is involved in muscle contraction. Most importantly, the muscle contraction of the heart, and also the electrical activity of the heart. That's why we worry about potassium, is because of how it affects the heart. High potassium, super high potassium, will cause the heart to stop. High potassium will cause the heart to stop. And in fact, that's how they kill people who are on death row. If you've ever heard of death by lethal injection, what are they injecting? Potassium. Potassium will cause the heart to stop. So it's a very important electrolyte. You have hypokalemia, or low potassium, when your blood concentration is less than 3.5. Anybody have any questions? I thought I heard something on Zoom.
I just was going to share something, but you can keep going. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Was it about Potassium?
I was just gonna share that last December my mom coded, and so I was able to do CPR on her, but then they found out that her potassium was 8.3, and so she had coded 5 more times after that. But they rushed her into surgery and got a hemodialysis cath and did a like a just potassium like pull off, not not um not like the dialysis part, but just potassium.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'm going to mute you because we're getting a weird feedback thing. Yeah, so you get your potassium up around 8 or something, and absolutely, that's very common. And the reason that happens, there's only one patient who gets their potassium that high, and that is somebody whose kidneys have shut down. And so that's why the only antidote for that is to put in a dialysis catheter and dialysis. Is that what happened to her? I'm assuming her creatinine probably was sky high?
Yes, it was something due to the fact that her kidneys, she was having some issues that week with her kidneys. She knew something was up, but then at 3 a.m. she coded.
Yeah, that's so scary.
Yeah.
So that would be called hyperkalemia. Right now we're talking about hypokalemia. And one thing to kind of know about low potassium, even though the book makes it sound like it's a big deal, and we do treat it like it's a big deal, it's not nearly as big of a deal as high potassium. A real low potassium, it can cause some problems, maybe, but you don't necessarily die from a low potassium. And the most common cause of a low potassium is diuretic therapy, meaning we've given this patient some Lasix. We give some Lasix, and as soon as we give Lasix, you pee out all of your potassium. You could also lose potassium from vomiting, diarrhea, things like that. And you have some EKG changes. Your electrical activity of your heart changes, but not in a way that's life-threatening. Like if you get a flattened T wave or a prominent U wave, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't really affect you. The reason we do care about low potassium is because it almost always goes hand in hand with the low magnesium. And once you start getting more than one electrolyte out of whack and low, then you can start having some problems. So low potassium, we do try to fix it. Another problem is it causes muscle weakness, and people feel weak. And then a third problem, probably the most common problem actually, is a low potassium tends to cause an ileus in your gut. And so you'll see patients who develop a bowel obstruction, just severe constipation that can eventually turn into obstruction. So we do treat the potassium, but it's not life-threatening like high potassium is. So the word for that, hyperkalemia. Hyperkalemia. Of all the electrolyte disturbances in this chapter, this is the true emergency. The run, don't walk emergency. It's called high when your serum potassium is greater than 5.2. So memorize those numbers. Remember, low potassium is less than 3.5. So the range, 3.5 to 5.2. And almost all the time, like 98% of the time, there are other causes, but 98% of the time, the real cause of high potassium is your kidneys have shut down. Because if your kidneys are working perfectly fine, then a healthy person with healthy kidneys will equalize potassium levels very quickly. So even if you took a bunch of potassium, if you ate 15 bananas and had this high potassium load, as long as your kidneys are working, they will fix the problem almost immediately. Once your kidneys stop working really well for whatever reason, then your kidneys can't secrete that potassium, and that's when you get hyperkalemia. And this does talk about exactly what you had described, where if your mom had been hooked up to an EKG, we would see this QRS that gets wide, tall peaked T waves. And I don't know if this has a picture. Oh yeah, a couple slides in, they have a picture of a tall peaked T wave. And it really looks like a triangle. That T wave looks like a triangle. That's a symptom of high potassium. High potassium. I skipped a slide here. If levels are severe, greater than 7, we have to do immediate treatment to get that potassium down. Get that potassium down. The very first drug that we give is not actually on this slide. The very first drug that we give, if your potassium is so high that you have EKG changes, first drug we give is actually calcium. Calcium. We were looking at this at clinicals on Tuesday because we had a code blue situation. As students, we were playing with the crash cart. The crash cart has laying right on the very top shelf vials of calcium chloride. And calcium comes in 2 different types. There's calcium chloride and calcium gluconate. But the crash cart had calcium chloride on it. And the only reason it has calcium chloride is that's the first choice drug to give if somebody's potassium is greater than 7 and they've got EKG changes. We give that calcium chloride, it stabilizes that heart rhythm. And then we give some other meds. These other 3 meds, D50, that's just sugar water. And Crash Cart has an amp of D50 ready to go. The other thing we give is insulin. And we give those 2 together. And the reason we give sugar and insulin to treat high potassium is the insulin allows that sugar to rush into the cells. When that dextrose, the D50, is rushing into the cells, it's taking potassium with it. So the potassium is out here in the blood vessel. We give an amp of D50. We give like 10 units of regular insulin. And all of that sugar rushes into the muscle cells and the potassium goes with it. Nice thing about taking the potassium out of the blood vessels is then that heart rhythm goes back to normal. First choice though, calcium, and then insulin D50 and sodium bicarb. All of those things are just temporary measures. They're not fixing the problem. They're just buying us a little time to get that patient to dialysis. Because the real treatment is going to have to be dialysis because the real problem is the kidneys have shut down. The kidneys have shut down. So all of the treatment for high potassium, hyperkalemia, is just to buy us time until we can get that dialysis catheter put in. We have to take patients to surgery to get a dialysis catheter put in and then run hemodialysis to get that potassium level down. If your kidneys are working fine, you won't ever have a problem with high potassium. There are some other situations where you can have problems with high potassium, and one of those situations is called rhabdomyolysis. Rhabdo. I remember when I was a kid, I used to watch a TV show, and I can't remember the name of that show. I think it was called Rescue 911 or something. It was like the TV show ER, only it was a 1980s show way back when, and we were watching reruns of Rescue 911. And one of the episodes, a man got pinned under a tractor. He got squished under a tractor, like a big old front loader tractor with a bucket, and his legs were squished under the bucket. And then the ambulance had to rush to the scene, and then they were trying to get him unpinned from under the bucket. But as soon as they lifted the bucket, the man died. And I don't know, maybe 8 years old when I watched this. It really bothered me. Like, why did the guy die? As soon as they rescued him, he died. The reason he died is because he had a crush injury. And a crush injury means a lot of little muscle cells have been squished. Those muscle cells are broken open. And potassium happens to be the number one intracellular ion. And when you squish the muscle cells, the potassium rushes out into the bloodstream. A high potassium load rushing out into the bloodstream isn't a problem when you have a tractor sitting on your legs, because that potassium can't get to your heart. As soon as they lift the tractor off the patient, all that blood rushes to the heart, and all that potassium rushes to the heart, cardiac arrest. And that's actually a very common problem in trauma patients with crush injuries out on the interstate. They deal with this all the time. Somebody is pinned under their car. What the paramedics do now is they start an IV, they give the calcium, then they lift the car to prevent that high potassium. The calcium imbalances, we don't see as much. I've honestly never even memorized these normals. It's because as a nurse working at the bedside, how often am I dealing with this? Not much in my day-to-day life, not dealing with it much. I just noticed this slide has hyper and hypo backwards. Levels greater than 10 are called hyper. The word hypo means low. Hypo means low. So hypocalcemia is less than 8.7. Hypercalcemia greater than 10. So on this slide, there's a little typo. I just noticed it. I hope the book is not wrong. Geez, I looked at the book today. Some of the fun symptoms, though, of low calcium, some of the fun symptoms are Chvostek's sign and Trousseau's sign. And those are both just symptoms of low calcium we actually see both of those signs more often when I do mental health clinicals. Mental health clinicals, we see both of those signs because there's just this weird little thing that happens when you hyperventilate. If you're having a panic attack and you hyperventilate and you're breathing really fast and breathing really deep, when you're hyperventilating, you drop your carbon dioxide, blow off CO2, and it just so happens, it's a weird thing that happens in your bloodstream. When you drop your CO2, your calcium disappears. What's actually happening is the calcium is binding to the albumin floating in your bloodstream. Anyway, you're hyperventilating, having a panic attack, your calcium level drops. And so all of these symptoms of low calcium, we tend to see on the mental health units from time to time when somebody's having a panic attack. Probably the most common are paresthesia. Paresthesia, fancy word for that feeling of pins and needles or tingling in your hands or feet. Have you ever had like tingling sensations in your hands? You think you're going crazy? That's called a paresthesia, a symptom of low calcium. And if it gets low enough, you'll have weird spasms, muscle spasms. And that's what Chvostek's sign is, a muscle spasm when we tap somebody's cheekbone. It's kind of a spasm. Trousseau's is a wrist spasm when we pump up a blood pressure cuff on their arm. Their wrist spasms. Just a symptom of low calcium. If the patient is hyperventilating from a panic attack, we just have them slow their breathing down, slow your breathing down, slow it down, and then the calcium fixes itself. Calcium fixes itself. We do mess with phosphate a bit in the hospital. Blood levels less than 2.5 are low, high phosphate at 4.5. So as a nurse, you might hang a bag of phosphate, fix that. Same with magnesium, low blood levels or high blood level. Magnesium goes hand in hand with potassium levels, and patients that have low potassium tend to have low magnesium. And you get your magnesium too low, you can have funky, weird heart arrhythmias. Weird heart arrhythmias. And the most common patient we see this in, low magnesium with funky heart arrhythmias, is your homeless alcoholic. The homeless alcoholic. Because when you drink alcohol, you almost immediately pee out all of your magnesium. For whatever reason, when you drink alcohol, you pee out all your magnesium. And if you're drinking alcohol every single day, all day, these guys will come in with crazy low magnesium levels, and they often go into a weird cardiac arrhythmia that's called torsade de pointe. Torsade de pointe. Just a random weird arrhythmia, almost always fatal.